Hi, everyone, and welcome to Subsistence Crop, a podcast cultivated by the Cannabis Studies Lab at Cal Poly Humboldt, where we talk about human cannabis relationships beyond commerce and prohibition.
Tony, so I'm stoked to have you here, and I'm going to let Cade take it away.
Hey, Tony, what's up? What's up? So, I hear you grew up in the Bay. And I guess I want to know, what was, like, your first impression with Humboldt County growing up in the Bay?
Well, I didn't grow up in the Bay. I grew up on the East Coast. I'm a auto worker roots in Syracuse, New York, upstate New York.
Oh, wow.
So,
But he heard you were a homeless kid in San Francisco for a little bit.
I came in, so I did the cross country tour from New York to California.
Okay.
I wanted to get into grad school.
Okay.
I knew that California was going to be a much more accommodating place for my cultural needs and also financial needs because grad school was very expensive back east. So I ended up in San Francisco, no place to live. Luckily, I was, I don't know how do I describe it, given the tip to go to this environmental organization that was hiring anybody, and was able to get a job as a canvasser for a environmental group there in San Francisco. So I was able to save some money, and I saved enough money to live in it's like a hostel, but it was like a $12 a day hostel right on Minna Street in the 90s.
Okay.
Was not necessarily the hostels that folks are familiar with now, right? I mean, you folks without homes in there, and it was, cockroaches and all the rest of the stuff. But it was $12, and you could afford that. You could hustle $12 to get a place to sleep. So,
Right.
and from there I worked my way through, saved some money and was able to get a job after the environmental canvasser job. What's interesting, I was raised, like I say, with sort of union ethics and sort of an understanding of working class issues. And moving out here, I really got an understanding of environmental issues. And that group, I don't want to name it, it's kind of embarrassing actually, helped get me into that world that I was not really aware of back east. So,
Nice.
And then I came up here.
What age did you come up here?
What got me coming up here? I could be quite honest right now that legalization has happened. Being homeless in the Bay and hustling, I ran into a bunch of really amazing people who were in the industry. And one of my good friends was a bike dealer, bike messenger dealer.
Like a motorcycle?
No,
Or like an actual bicycle?
No, it's bicycle. A bicycle. He's a
Like
deadhead.
with a backpack.
It's a deadhead who, put a backpack on, go up to the Haight, and he would hustle weed. And he would come into the hostel because he was also homeless, and we would hang out. He was a heavy duty deadhead, and I had no idea. Like I was into reggae. I wasn't into the dead back then. But he would read off the set list and talk about what he did, and then one day he's like, I'm going up to Humboldt. How are you getting up to Humboldt? He's like, I borrowed a friend's car, and he had to make a run. So I made a run up with him, and experienced, Humboldt firsthand. And this was like 92, I think. Yeah, 1992.
And did you go to college up in Humboldt?
No, I was just working, living in a hostel. I mean, basically homeless then, and saw this place and was like, wow, this is really awesome. I never came to this campus. It wasn't even on my radar.
Okay.
So I made a couple trips back with him, and so that's how I got somewhat familiar with this area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then college?
I went, I got my master's up here in Humboldt, but I got my college degree back east.
Okay.
Back east.
Where'd you study and what did you study?
Sociology. I was not going to go to school, like I say, at working class roots. I didn't get in any colleges. I played lacrosse, and Luckily, like a month or two before the semester started, somebody was starting a team and had some connections, and they say, hey, you want to go to school at this place? They're starting a lacrosse team, and then that got me into college.
Cool.
Was that Syracuse?
No,
What
it was a
was it?
small little school called Cayuga College, upstate New York. It was an all-women's school back in the 80s, and then at that time, those sort of same-sex schools, there wasn't any money, so they had to go co-ed, and they brought in, of course,
Lacrosse.
athletes. Like, who's going to go? Like, so they bring in sports teams, and that's how they build it up. There was 400 students in the college when I arrived,
crazy.
and 2 teams. And I moved from major to major. And my students have heard this story of how I arrived at sociology dozens of times. But, you know, you're in college for your first time, first gen, and what's your major? Business, right? And so you're taking business classes. And I was in there for a semester. I'm like, this is not for me. I was in love with this person at the same time. And I was taking an English class, and I was writing amazing papers about love. And the English professor was like, you should be an English major because this is awesome work.
Okay.
And so it became an English major that same semester.
Okay.
And then the winter time happened, and then they broke up with me. And I didn't want to be an English major anymore. I became a social work major because I wanted to help people because my heart was broken. And that didn't work out. The school that I went to it was a great school. Now I couldn't afford it. But one of the things you had to do was you had to do a field period every year. So for 4 years, you had to spend the month of January doing an internship in your field. It's a freshman, sophomore, junior. So you've got really the opportunity to experience like your discipline and what your job would be like if you move through that as a major. And yeah, I was not a caseworker. So yeah, and then I got in a lot of trouble that semester, and was taking a social class. My grades were good, but my social stuff was not as up to par, I guess. You know, the cultural changes as you're, first gen folks are like, oh, you're free, and then people are telling you what to do while you're paying them a lot of money to live in a place that you shouldn't be paying them that much money. So I got in a lot of trouble, and the social professor really helped me make sense of it.
Nice.
And sociologist just came to me and spoke to me. So
was it from there that you were like, I could maybe teach in this?
I just loved the lens and the sort of insight it gave me into how the world worked.
Nice.
Right? Like y'all, cannabis studies, right? I mean, you got a great interdisciplinary major. I would have been a cannabis studies major.
Really?
Hardcore. If as a freshman walking in, no doubt, back in the 80s. But yeah, so I developed a really strong connection with this professor, Dr. Ulrich. And his last, which was super cool, my last semester, I needed to do that internship placement. And he received his doctorate from a European institution in Holland. And he said, how about you go study with my mentor in Holland?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah. I was like, I don't have the money.
Wow.
And he said, I'll loan it to you.
Oh, wow. Your professor did?
He loaned me $1,000.
Wow.
And I was able to go, and my first overseas experience.
Sick.
And studied in Rotterdam at the University of Utrecht. It was Rotterdam. They changed the name a few years back, but I was able to study with my mentor's mentor and experience Holland, okay, in the 80s. Or 90s, early 90s. So it was fabulous, and I just felt so, honored. Paid him back in full. But what was really interesting when I got there, they set me up with a housing situation there with a bunch of other Dutch students, and there's a map on the wall of the United States, and there's pins all over it. And, I take a shower, come out, and I'm like, hey, what's going on? What is this? And they're all like, oh, that's places we've been. And it was the map was like covered with dots. And they're like, where have you been? New York, Syracuse, industry, and then Canada, right? Because you can buy beer over Canada at 18. You drive 2 hours, and that was really it. And that's that's how I got to California. You know, I got home, I was like, I got to get on the road. I got to see my country, you know? Because at that time, that's what I felt. Like, all these Dutch people, they've seen it, and I've not even experienced it, so.
Yeah.
Had you read any like Jack Kerouac or On the Road and
No.
anything like that? Okay.
No, none of that. No, I was kind of sheltered in terms of my education and my sort of understanding of that literature at that time, right? Yeah, it was Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and sports, right? You know, a working class kid. It was, different.
What was the change of culture for cannabis coming from the East Coast and then San Fran up to Humboldt?
Felonies and then no jail time.
Yeah.
Right? And you're worried about having a seed or a joint in your car and being in a hell of a lot of trouble back east. Yeah. And out here, I think my first time in Arcata, you know, my friend, who will go unnamed, he still lives in this community, you know, we pulled up across from the the police station, and he's rolling a joint, and I'm losing my mind. I'm like, what are you doing? The police station's there. It's like, this is Arcata. It's California. And I was like, that was 94, 93, 93, and it was like, okay. It just felt like...
You talking about the station in Arcata or
right
the
in Arcata.
or the one on campus?
Right in Arcata.
Right in
By
Arcata.
the library?
By the library.
Right in Arcata. Yep. It was like mind blowing, right? And living in San Francisco, it's totally like, it was liberal. You could tell that like it's a total different vibe. But coming up here, you know, and experiencing that was something super unique and really helped to, you know, culture me to this place.
Nice.
You know?
So I know a lot of the students are excited for your take on. So you're teaching the Humboldt and Cannabis class,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I know a lot of students are excited for that. Can you give us a little rundown on maybe your expectations on the class?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, you know, I want to go back to the history of our department teaching courses around cannabis, because I think there's a really cool origin story to this, right? In the 90s, I forget what chair was here at the time, but our department in sociology developed a course called the Emerald Triangle. And it was a course that was primarily, I think, prohibition oriented, right, in terms of its approach, you know, to, you know, the intellectual inquiry around cannabis. It was taught by a former police officer, I think. Okay. And so it was a course that was offered. It was a weekend workshop. It was a 1-unit workshop. So students would come in from Friday from, you know, 5 to 8, and then Saturday they do an all day. And it would be 1 unit, and it'd offer courses or offer students an opportunity to get the 1 unit if they needed to graduate. And they would have law enforcement come in. They'd have other people who were involved in, I would say, cannabis enforcement at the time, come in and talk about the Emerald Triangle, the history of it. And when I was a faculty member here, that sort of shifted. We had folks who were actually a little bit more knowledgeable about the industry teach the class, and I was able to get a chance to teach it and use some of my insider knowledge to help inform the sort of topics that were discussed. So we were teaching it, myself, Joss Mizell, Karen August, and a couple other instructors. We started to enlarge the themes. So we were looking at cannabis culture in Humboldt, looking at the environmental issues around cannabis agriculture, looking at law enforcement, of course, looking at medical cannabis, and we would spend the weekend doing that. So that informs how I am gonna, you know, explore a little bit of this for Humboldt and Cannabis. Right? I mean, Ray Raphael comes to mind as like a book that I'd love to use if I could find it in print, which you can't.
I have all of his books in print.
But can students get it, I guess is the question.
I have Well, first of all, like a lot of them have been scanned for the class last year, and the library is now really good about like if you want anything scanned,
Oh, that's great.
you just let them know and they get it to you real fast because they don't want you doing the scanning because that's going to have accessibility issues. But real quick, there's a couple things here that I feel like we might have skipped over. And for now, let me just go back to the most direct one. When did you first teach the Emerald Triangle class? About what year was that?
2007, maybe.
Yeah, so you're talking about like Emerald Triangle class was invented in the 90s, you say?
I want to say late 90s.
Late 90s.
Late 90s. I remember when I was a graduate student here up to 97.
Yeah.
I remember, conversations about it. I don't know exactly, but that'd be a great question to
Yeah,
ask Betsy. What Betsy Watson would know.
Right, she would, wouldn't she?
Yeah.
My students know her from a different context.
Yes.
Was that the first time you taught?
No, I was actually teaching environmental sociology courses here in the 90s. 1999 was my first lecture job here. I taught stats and environmental soc, and then social ecology, more environmental focused courses in sociology.
That was with your master's degree.
That was with my master's, and I was finishing up my PhD at the time. Okay. And then I taught again in 2000, and then came back down here in 01. I finally came back here in 05 as a lecturer living here, and then became on the tenure track in 2015. So I have over a decade of experience as a lecturer here at Humboldt, and I started to teach 2007 Emerald Triangle, and that's when I came back here. I'll maybe give you a background, like how did I get involved in this environment and cannabis stuff, right? As a grad student, and you all are students here, right? During the 90s, economically, it was just made sense to work in the industry. So many of us worked as trimmers and as workers helping to do cultivation to help us through grad school. So that's what I did to help me save money in the 90s going to grad school here. So I had sort of firsthand knowledge of the conditions in the fields, if you will, and cultivation practices. When I came back in 05, again, we all have, you live here, you have many friends, you're embedded in the cultures, like, people in the industry. I was visiting indoor and outdoor grows in 05, and I was like, it was crazy. It was the indoor piece. I was walking into rooms where people were, blowing mite bombs when the plants are flowering, using, toxic chemicals on plants and things that they shouldn't be using during flowering. And it was like, okay. And then going outside, visiting friends down in southern Humboldt in northern Mendo they bought property from former timberland owners who logged the hell out of it and then sold the land to growers. And then the growers came in and just did what the timber industry did and just sort of industrialized the place. So I came down in 05 and 06, and I was like, this is crazy. Like, it is just, there is some ecological impacts that are happening here on a scale that I've not seen before, and no one is talking about it. And we had the code of silence in the industry, we had the code of silence in our communities for good reason, right? You don't want to rat your neighbors out, right? Because then the heat's going to come on you. So, it just got to the point where, as an academic, this is something like we have to start talking about this. And working in the environmental community here for many years, I've been on the board of a number of environmental organizations here. It just became one of those topics that we had to address. And the code of silence sort of, folks recognized in the hills, like, okay, we can't have diesel spills on the creek because it affects everybody. So I started to investigate that as a sociologist. And that's where I got into sort of the environmental impacts of industrial cannabis agriculture. I want to be very clear, it's industrial cannabis production was what I was sort of researching. And started that in like '07. And that has been my sort of area of expertise ever since, and what I know most about.
That's really cool. And so do you plan on bringing that into the Humboldt and Cannabis class?
Yes, definitely that history, right? And we have a new history now, right? It's the most environmentally regulated plant in the world, right? So we have a different conversation now as we go through time and how we have had different relationships with the plant, right? So I think it's going to be a very interesting historical conversation, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really valuable. And Dominic, I think when you taught this, you did a lot of the same stuff, right? And you brought in some amazing folks.
Yeah, that was a strategy adapted from the Emerald Triangle class because I did my time guesting on a lot of the times when he was teaching.
I want to know about that.
Well, I'll let him tell you about it.
It's awesome. It was, we tagged up a couple times to just do, a Humboldt cannabis class.
Basically.
We did an extended ed class when you were living in Washington, and you zoomed in, I think, for the first time. And this was prior to, prior to me even being a tenure-line professor.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. So we, Dominic and I go way back, and we, both of us, prior to getting into the positions we're in, were really, advocates of understanding more about cannabis culture and agriculture and policing, unburdened by the restrictions of institutions, right? And boy, were we burdened. I tell you. We, back when I first started doing sort of public presentations and organizing talks on best management practices around cannabis agriculture, we had lots of pushback from the institution about our holding the event, just holding the event itself, because they viewed it as advocacy. So when talking about best management practices, they were afraid of federal retribution, if you will, right? Which was kind of, a little bit absurd. So many times I was told to change the title of a panel or a presentation.
Really?
Yeah, from best management practice. They say, Tony, you can't have that in the title.
Wow.
It's like, why? That's advocacy. It's like, are you kidding me? Forestry has best management. We're talking about what would be those best management practices. So that, the green scare, I don't know how we frame it, but there was certainly a fear that we were going into territory that the institution did not want to get into. And Dominic can talk for hours about the development of this program and some of the hurdles we had to overcome to make this happen, and to convince folks like this is like a legitimate field, and
which we may have actually sort of just dreamed up ourselves in 2009 when our first conversation, when Joe Eckert told me to go talk to you. His former student became a graduate school colleague of mine when I was finishing and he was starting, and we got to talking about Humboldt, and he's like, "You should go talk to Tony Silvaggio." So I did. I showed up and went over to his office, and I found someone who I could talk to academically about it. There were very few other people. Sunil would have been someone I'd been already talking to about it, but Sunil was less on the ag side. But really, I was interested in cannabis agriculture and the connection to the 60s and social movements, which Tony had a strong grounding in as well. And so that Humboldt and Cannabis class is started developing then, I'd say.
Nice.
The stuff that I went through, this is why it's going to be awesome to have Tony step into it.
Yeah.
Is that he's actually going to have a very similar approach. And the emphasis on the primary data to you, the people who lived through it, is super important. It's unique for this class, right?
For sure.
So we'll play around with readings and so forth, but I don't want to get to. But I just want to emphasize that, like, together, like, our brains developed around this,
Definitely.
like significantly.
Definitely.
Like where I'm at and what I'm doing right now has everything to do with talking to Tony very early on and coming back and continuing to talk to him.
So we got a question or two from some other students.
Please.
I'll shoot out the first one. Can Tony tell us some local social movements that on the surface don't look like they're associated with cannabis, but they actually are?
Oh, the environmental movement for sure. I mean, that's a no-brainer these days, right? But back in 2012 and 11, they were integral to putting on one of the first cannabis in the environment symposiums that we had. 2013 here, March 2013. It was the organizing crew was basically all of the grassroots environmental movements here. So it was EPIC, it was Friends of the Eel, it was the Mattole Restoration Council, and those folks who recognized that we needed to really come up with a way to have a industry that was sustainable, right? And really work on finding best management practices for cannabis. So definitely the environment. Other social movements, of course, labor, right, is another one that is just recently getting involved in the cannabis space, whatever you want to call it. I sit on the Central Labor Council here at Humboldt Del Norte, and we have unions there that are working to help workers in the industry get represented and making sure that their interests are being met. It's a really great thing to have that unionization of cannabis workers. It's happened in larger urban areas a little quicker because of the organizational capacities of those groups, but it's definitely working out here. Other social movements. I mean, it's you have the environmental justice movement, right? You have issues around sort of racial capital, right? That folks have equity and justice. So you have the sort of civil rights movement, if you want to talk in larger movements. Yeah.
We've been talking about that a lot in the Cannabis and Social Equity course. I do think that he may have been referring even a little more deeper historically. Although I'll note the 2013 symposium, which actually, like, because you reminded me and threw me the PDF the night before, I opened our symposium last week,
It was great.
referring it. Those people, a good number of them were also cannabis cultivators, in addition to their, occupations as directors of different nonprofits, right?
Well, yeah, Casey was there.
Casey was
Brad,
there.
A couple other.
Hezekiah, and those are two we can say publicly, I believe.
Yep.
I won't go in any further because those two we can say publicly for sure.
But I think you were talking more about like the 60s,
The 90s,
right?
and this is something that you passed over
The
quite
medical,
a bit.
I mean, the medical like movements, right?
Well,
oof.
and the timber wars.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Okay, that type of connection. Okay.
yeah.
I wanted to hear it all. The students want to hear it all. I'm
They are,
glad you answered it all.
Well, again, you have an industry that is unregulated. It's, one in which you're getting $3,000 to $4,000 a pound. That money really helped to establish sort of a stronghold of resistance to timber extraction here, right? So you have that money helped to fund campaigns to some extent and fund people so that they could do activist work, basically, right? It's hard to be a 24-hour activist if you don't have a job, right? You got to have some way to make some money. So cannabis, did and still does provide people with that opportunity to, engage in protest movements and organizing.
Gotcha.
Right.
Gotcha.
And with, I think, I'm not saying that like if cannabis wasn't here, we're still going to have those movements because we still had those movements in Montana and the East Coast, but it really helped to shape the culture here, right?
Yeah.
Ecotopia, Earth First, right? Where like you go to an event, you go to Earth First Ronde, and like you can't have alcohol. Like they had a no alcohol rule, but you could smoke as much weed as you wanted, right? You had people coming from Montana and they were like, "What's up with these ecotopias?" Right? Like I want my beer in my rendezvous. So you had a lot of those cultural conflicts within the radical environmental movement, that's a story in itself. But I'll bring some of that in too, right? Sort of how
That's good.
those connections with direct action movements. Environmental movements, the radical environmental movement.
That's great. Another student question. Tony, tell us about your marijuana love story.
My marijuana love story. Oh, yes. I have a love story with marijuana. I've always had it.
The book.
Yes, the book. Yes. Well, it's one of those books where you have to, it's an insider book, really, if you know the culture here. And if you're interested in the culture here, because it sort of just tells the story of sort of the evolution and history of the plant in a very digestible way. So it's a really accessible book for folks who just want to learn a little bit about the plant and laugh a little bit. And there's some stories that are sprinkled in there from experience with names that aren't real, but the stories actually happened.
Nice.
Yeah, there's some fun stories of sort of bad marijuana experiments, and learning how to grow the plant. And there's also a history there, right? A botanical history, brief, right? There's also a bit of the prohibitionist history there. So we try to cover a lot of topics, but in an accessible way that's not too academic, and it's I encourage folks to pick it up, and it's got some some suggestions about where the direction that we may want to think about being headed, about the industry where we need to head. There's the theme around the environment that runs throughout the book, and about environmental impacts, and how to have a sustainable industry, and what does a sustainable industry look like? Yeah. Right. Do we need indoor cannabis agriculture? Right. And we have climate change happening, and we have the sun that does everything. Right. So there's some policy positions that I take there that aren't the most popular, but I think if we're really trying to tackle these global problems and issues, I think we need to have those conversations and see what we can do as a community to address those.
And our last student question is, what was cannabis culture like when you were a graduate student here, and how has that changed?
Oh, it's fabulous. It was like, wasn't like that sort of peak moment, right? What folks I think would say in the 80s. Late 80s, but I think it was great. Reggae in the River was just growing from 5,000 people, right, to like 50, right? So it was still, you had, a tight-knit community here. A lot of folks were, again, being super policed, right? Camp was still happening, but you had a campus here that was just, energized.
Would they hold the 420 events up at the
They would hold the 420 events, and what's really important, and this is what Dominic brought up, like you had this sort of confluence of a forest defense movement where you had protests here on campus against Pacific lumber, old growth logging, right? And a lot of weed smoking too. Yeah. So I think you have those two cultures come together, and it's it was a very different place.
How liberal were the campus rules and regs around weed smoking in practice? Would you say that there was more weed smoking on campus than you see today?
People were growing weed in their dorm rooms,
That's
Dominic.
that's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
I had friends who got arrested because they brought in an undercover police officer in the dorms, and then they arrested them because they were growing some plants in their dorm. They brought an undercover cop in the dorms. This is 94.
But
95.
they were doing dorm checks and stuff back then, no? Because you couldn't pull that out nowadays just because they're doing all of those frequent dorm checks. But
It's a different, again,
back
culturally,
then,
it's
right,
a different place, right?
changed.
It's a different place, certainly. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, sort of, yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that I try to impart a sense of historical change that is, not linear, right? One that so the dorm check undercover cop is pre-96. After 98, when the local sheriff really kind of just says, okay, we're going to tolerate it within certain guidelines, things end up a lot more out in the open, let's say, in terms of the acceptability of public smoking or even smoking indoors or whatever else. Cigarettes were being smoked indoors, right? But this city had a much more tolerant, I think.
Yes, 100%.
And the university itself.
Yes. You weren't hyper policed for weed.
No.
I know if you go out the dorms, and you're smoking near one of those little sort of gazebos, you could probably get policed on because you can't smoke there, right? And you can't smoke on the corner here now. But back then it was very, tolerated. And everywhere though. It's not just here. The whole county, primarily. Scotia and Fortuna, those were sort of the timber towns. You had dreads. You didn't want to be walking around Scotia and Fortuna. They would, during the timber wars, they wouldn't serve someone who looked like an environmentalist in those communities. They wouldn't serve you food. It says earth firsters not allowed, right?
And that was when?
And that was late 80s, early 90s.
Wow.
Yeah, you still had that.
You guys still had sundown towns in the 80s, right?
I don't know here.
Not in
Not
California.
here, not here.
Maybe Oregon.
I've
Maybe
heard
Oregon.
some stories of Del Norte having some
Oh,
sundown
Del Norte.
stories in the 80s.
Yeah,
That's different.
I wouldn't be able to say yay or nay, but I wouldn't put it past them. Yeah.
Interesting.
Certainly different place.
Yeah.
But it was this. Yeah, it was wonderful for us as students. It was a great place to get involved in community activism and organizing around whatever issue it was really meaningful to you. And it was embraced by the administration too. Administrators weren't out there telling, students what's appropriate. We have right now, the war in Palestine, right? And people you can do this. And there was none of that, right? You had for an hour environmentalists, and then the next hour you had the students in the forestry department, right? It's and wasn't always polite, but we weren't hyper policing student protest. So it seems like we treat students like your children more and more, and that's how we view you. And you need to be supervised at every moment of your presence here and on this institution, and it's very different. It was very different back then.
I think a lot of kids leave for college to get independence, and so when they come to a university where they don't feel that independence, that's hard, and a lot of kids might want to leave and drop out, and so it's interesting.
Yeah, and send that one to the retention people. How to retain students. Don't treat them like children. You got any more questions, Cade?
No, that was it. That was great. Super informative.
Hell yeah. And just as a reminder, Tony's going to be teaching Humboldt and Cannabis in the fall, in case anyone listening wants to know about that. The prereq is Intro to Cannabis Studies, but that is kind of something that we need to deal with because like it's not necessary. And also like just email me for an exception if you want to enroll in that class without having taken Cannabis 120. I'm just going to get that out there.
Yeah, and I don't know when this is going to roll out, but on the 21st, which is Sunday, there is, if you're local here, listening on the podcast, we have an Earth Day celebration here at Pearson Park at 1 o'clock in McKinleyville. It's an action-oriented Earth Day where there's going to be Know Your Rights trainings for student organizers in any movement to teach you a little bit about your rights when engaging in protest by an amazing lawyer from Oregon, Lauren Regan from the Civil Liberties Defense Center. There's going to be tripod trainings to learn how to put up forced defense barricades. And there's also going to be, the traditional bird watching, IDing, workshops and skill shares, bike maintenance, kid zone, great speakers, music, indigenous funk and roots by Good Shield and Seventh Generation Rise. So if you have time, head on out there. Some of the Cannabis Studies students are actually going to be working that event.
Really?
We've hired them for helping to staff the event. So yeah, it's going to be a blast. Sunday.
Fantastic.
It's supposed to be nice out too. And it's not 420. Usually we have it on Saturday, Earth Day, Saturday, but this year it falls on 420, and we didn't want to compete with 420. So we moved it to 421, which is a Sunday. It's okay. But yeah, it should be a great time.
Sounds good. I'll be there for sure.
Yeah.
There's no way this is going to get out in time for this to actually. This isn't radio, but we gotta process it and put it up.
That's okay. Well, for next year, it's going to happen. There'll be a third annual. Well, I really appreciate y'all having me here. It's great to be in the Cannabis Lab. This is the first time I sat behind the mic. Y'all do a great production here, and I'm hoping next semester that you can continue this and you're doing great work, and it's a great. I mean, this for those that want to plug into the major. This is one of the only majors I know that have such a variety of opportunities to plug into. Right? I mean, just last week, like you say, Dominic, you had that amazing conference with all of the policymakers in the state, and you're all interacting with them, right, on that level, and learning how to put on a conference. And now you're doing podcasts. You got field work with Dan.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just like with the shoestring budget we have here for this program, y'all are doing amazing work, and I think. I would love to try to build up our major, sociology and criminology, with this sort of sense of community that you all have here. It's really inspiring. And it's like what we should aspire to, right? As a programming, every program, because that culture that you've created is it's tight.
Thanks, Tony. Well, it's a culture that, now includes some pretty awesome other teachers in it. And, you, Dan Marr, Michelle Newhart, William Dolphin, I'm looking forward to my students getting to experience you as a teacher because they've had me, and I've been all right, but, you're actually good at what you do. So I'm largely winging it. But they've enjoyed it nonetheless. But I'm just stoked to have you here on the podcast, and thank you so much for coming by, Tony.
Thanks, Joe.
It's been a blast. Thanks, Tony. Thank you for growing with Subsistence Crop, a podcast by the Cannabis Studies Lab at Cal Poly Humboldt.